Hi, I'm Wojtek Breza. I'm going to be giving this lecture on basic mushroom identification. I'm a licensed pharmacist from the UK, East London. Nearly 20 years ago, for my degree, I specialised in pharmacognosy, which is the science of making medicines from natural sources such as plants, microbes, and mushrooms. This combined with my Polish ancestry and sparked a lifelong passion for mushrooms.
Hello and welcome, fellow mushroom enthusiasts, to this countdown of the top 10 edible mushrooms you can find in your backyard. If you would like to learn more about how to easily identify mushrooms, why not join our free course at mushroomexam.com. Our simple video tutorials teach you how to identify over 50 different mushrooms, so you can get some free nosh and impress your friends. There are thousands of different mushrooms. Each one can either be the tastiest or deadliest thing you have ever eaten. This top 10 is meant to teach you about mushrooms which are easiest to identify and the tastiest to eat. There are no clear-cut rules when trying to identify mushrooms. However, there are 4 general rules which you should follow. Red is bad apart from the rasulas. However, you need a bit more experience before you can identify those. Blanche white is bad. There is a mushroom called the destroying angel. Doesn't sound good, does it? The mushroom is blanche white and should be avoided at all costs. Brackets, mushrooms which grow on trees, like shells, are usually inedible, apart from the chicken of the woods, which we'll talk about in a moment. Lastly, blue is good to chew. This is an old saying and relates to the bluet mushroom, which is pretty plentiful. Let the countdown begin. Number 10. The shaggy parasol, Chlorophyllum rhacoides. This is a very common mushroom around the world. It's easily identified by its shaggy white and grey cap and its relatively large size. Keep in mind this mushroom can be toxic to some people if not properly cooked. When picking shaggy parasols, it has gills and spore prints which are both white in colour. Number 9. Horse mushroom, Agaricus arvensis. The gills are white at first, then turn chocolate brown. The mushroom itself smells like anise. It is found in stables and meadows. Be careful though, as the horse mushroom often gets confused with the yellow stainer, Agaricus xanthoderma. This one smells strongly of iodoform, or ink, not aniseed, and its flesh, when cut, stains strongly yellow. The horse mushroom will only go yellow on the outside. Number 8. The penny bun, or Porcini boletus edulis. This pretty little thing looks like it's just been dropped by a baker in the woods. The most important characteristic of these boletes are the absence of gills on the underside. Don't be afraid to pick them up. Have a look at the underside of the cap. There will be small pore holes instead of straight gills. Remember, boletes do not have gills. But be careful, almost all bullets are fine to eat, although there is one called the devil's bullet, which has a white top and a red underneath. Make sure if you see this that you avoid it. The hedgehog mushroom, number 7, Hydnum repandum. Its underside looks like a hedgehog, hence the name. Spore-bearing structures which are shaped like teeth rather than gills. They are usually orange, yellow or tan coloured. They are extremely tasty and they have a sweet, nutty taste and a crunchy texture. Number 6, morels. Be careful when identifying morels. You have something called the false morel and the morel. The difference can be seen here. A true morel has a honeycomb structure, which is quite regular. It's white or brown and it's hollow inside, whereas the false morel is mottled like an irregular brain. It's orange or red and it's solid on the inside. The chanterelle. It is a yellow or orange, meaty and funnel-shaped mushroom. On the lower surface, underneath the smooth cap, it has gill-like ridges which run almost all the way down its stipe. It has a fruity smell and reminiscent of apricots and a mildly peppery taste. Chanterelles can be black or red. The black chanterelle is black and velvety, funnel-shaped, wavy to rounded margin, fragrant, fruity odour, grows near pines and oaks, a choice edible mushroom. In French they are called trompe de mort, which means trumpets of death. The red type of chanterelle is the cinnamon chanterelle or Chanterellus cinnabarinus. It's got bright orange-red cap. Its flesh is fragile, thin, orange and red. It's got a fragrant, fruity odour. The gills are lighter than the cap and then continue all the way down the stalk. The stalk is thin and the same colour as the cap, the edibility of which it is a choice edible mushroom. However, because of its size, one would have to gather a lot to concoct a meal. Usually found growing near the common chanterelle, Chanterellus cibarius. Number 4, chicken of the woods, Lytiporus sulphureus, so a sulphur, a large bracket fungus which has multiple layers. A beautiful and almost garish orange and sulphur yellow coloration. It tastes like chicken and is a good meat substitute for vegetarians. Number 3, oyster mushroom or Plutorus ostratus. It can be easily cultivated. People can buy kits and grow them out of it. They contain statins, which are compounds which actually lower cholesterol. The mushroom itself smells like anise and is a good characteristic to differentiate from other mushrooms, and it's also used to make the Chinese oyster sauce. Enoki mushroom, number 2, Flammulina velotipes. They are long, thin, white mushrooms. You can often find these in Chinese supermarkets, and they're used in East Asian cuisine such as China, Japan, and Korea. They have a slightly fruity flavour. And the number 1 mushroom is the majestic truffle, Tuber melanosporum. This is specifically the black truffle.
Yeah, it's a little bit geeky, but it does the top 10 mushrooms. But what I found quite quickly was you can do the top 10 mushrooms around the world, but they vary massively between different parts of the world. And that's what Mushroom Exam is about. It's about having a look at the different common mushrooms around the world and trying to figure out how to help people become less fearful of picking mushrooms. So part of what I did was I went to and got scientific papers about hospital admissions in different parts of the world because of mushrooms, and we'll get onto this later, but it came as the understanding of something in medicine called differential diagnosis. And it's what I try to teach is we will highlight the most important mushrooms, the most gastronomic, the most medicinal, and then we'll have a look at the lookalikes, the mushrooms that are often confused and end people up in danger. And then before we go out mushroom hunting, we'll become as confident as possible that those mushrooms can be identified. Because my serious worry is that there are lots of mushrooms which are inedible. Great Terry Pratchett quote says, "All mushrooms are edible, but some only once." Means that picking mushrooms, you can eat all of them, but some of them might cause gastric upset, and some of them might even cause death. And because I find that quite an extreme thing, it's not the same as teaching someone about different types of vegetables, or different types of something kind of a little bit more inane. There's a life or death situation here. So what I've been very careful of is looking at how that can be communicated online. I do a lot of online, I've done a lot of online lecturing. I've done helped create lots of resources on mushroomexam.com. This is one of the series of audiovisual presentations that we're making, and then demonstrations. So we sometimes go out on forays in Sydney. I help arrange them in different parts of the world, and it's a really good idea to go out and have a physical experience with an expert on these things, so you can have the discussion and the practice doing. And then really, as you can see here on the right, this is called the cone of learning, and it just puts out these different levels. And what I think was really great about this is the average student retention rate. So this is how much people learn in these different types of formats. And as I said from the beginning, so lecturing, reading, audiovisual, demonstration, it just gets better and better as you go down. But the ease of accessibility of a lecture is a lot easier than reading, because you have to put effort into reading the text, and then audiovisual is more difficult to find. People don't make videos. Demonstration is really difficult because you've got time, you've got logistics, and then discussion, obviously you need more people. So what we're doing here is really starting right at the top. We're doing a lecture. If you've got access to mushroomexam.com, you've got the reading. You're obviously doing a bit of audio visual on this, and I'm gonna do a bit of demonstration on identification at the end. So we're really up in that kind of top part, and we're just starting out. So by the end of this lecture, I really want you to know what are the top 5 most deadly mushrooms in Australia, and figuring out how that works with other edible mushrooms. So what are the differentiating factors? We're going to talk about medicinal mushrooms, and we're going to then go on to identifying just 3 tasty mushrooms. And then the last part is we're going to summarize it all in kind of a rule of thumb to know the 5 basic rules of mushrooming without fear. And that's where I want to get you by the end of this. So in all, there's different scientific classifications of these things, but mine personally is that there's 3 types of mushroom. There's deadly mushrooms, which as Terry Pratchett said, you can only eat once. There's medicinal mushrooms, which you can eat but actually have kind of like a pharmacological medicinal effect on you. And there's tasty mushrooms. And classifying the deadly mushrooms and the medicinal together, I call them pharmacological, because they contain substances which have an effect on you. On one side they can kill you, and on the other side they can cure you. Then the third category of mushrooms are the common most tasty, which we'll get to afterwards. The reason why I've positioned these as 1, 2, 3 is it's, as I said, really important to understand what the most deadly are before you move on to the most tasty. And this quote: "The NSW Poisons Information Centre, which receives inquiries from NSW and ACT and Tasmania, so the majority of Australia, as well as after hours inquiries from all of Australia, received 549 calls during 2020. So 549 phone calls to these people about exposures to mushroom with another 133 recalls about these cases. So in that there's like 350 odd which were discarded, but there was like 133 which were followed up afterwards. 23% of calls were intentional recreational foraging exposures to adults. So whilst rare, these things are getting more popular. We're recently out on a foray in Penrose, which is kind of just south of Sydney, and we saw buses of people coming up with baskets. And there is a lot of enthusiasm for this type of thing, but part of what I'm trying to do here is make it a bit more safe. So more than a third of these calls were accidental exposure in children. And it kind of just goes on to say children are at risk. So before we go any further, the idea is this is for people over the age of 18 who are hopefully a bit more responsible, but you may have kids, and it's just a good idea if you do go into the woods and you have children, just keeping an eye on them in case they pick something up and pop it in their mouths. So these are the most common deadly mushrooms in Australia, and this data was from looking at hospital reports across the various different states. And by far the most deadly is actually the death cap, which is quite well named, I guess, and it encompasses the vast majority. The second one is the yellow staining mushroom, which looks a little bit like the mushrooms that you get in the supermarkets, which are called field mushrooms. The next one is ghost fungus nidiformis, is the Latin name. So a lot of the names that I'd be talking about in this lecture are what they call the common names, but all species, whether it's your dog or the plants out the window, they all have Latin called binomial names, where it's used a lot by sciencey people, but for the purpose of this, we're going to refer to it as the common name ghost fungus. Shaggy parasol, and then fly agaric is the Super Mario mushroom, which we'll get to. So death caps encompass 9 out of 10 deaths from mushroom poisoning in Australia. Right, so that's 90%, and if you go back to those figures, it's a very low percentage of people, but there are people every year. And question to myself is, why do these people end up? And it's purely because they haven't sat in lectures like this and someone has had to explain, look, if there is a mushroom and it has an olive green cap and gills underneath, best to leave it. As you advance in the study of mushrooms, which is called mycology, you'll find that there are some mushrooms that have an olive green cap and have gills, which are fine to eat. But we're not going to start there. As we're beginners in this, we're going to learn some rules of thumb, which are not to eat ones with gills and not to have one with olive green caps, to keep us safe. And once we learn 3, once we learn 5, we can move on to others. But yeah, as a general rule, death caps grow under oak trees, which are pretty rare in Australia anyway. It's mainly kind of eucalyptus and pine. The cap is 4 to 16 centimeters in diameter. The cap ranges in color from pale yellow to green to olive brown. The gills are white. That's the bit underneath. You can kind of see it in the little picture at the top there. And yeah, onset of symptoms, but we're not really going to get to that point because we're going to see these mushrooms and walk the other way. It's never a good idea, and a strong rule which I stick by and all mycologists stick by is, if you don't make a positive identification and you're not 100% sure, you keep on walking. The next one is the yellow staining mushroom, and as I said before, you can find a similar one called the field mushroom in your local supermarket, and this is the most common poisonous mushroom in Victoria, and they often grow in clusters in fairy rings with about 5 centimeters to 20 centimeters in diameter. The cap is usually white, become brown with age, so it looks pretty much identical to the button mushroom. The only differentiating factor is, firstly, it stains yellow. So when you bruise it, you can see this kind of like yellow color underneath, and that's something to avoid. Ghost fungus, which is one of my favorite because it's primarily found in Australia and Tasmania. So like the elkhorn, I don't know if you can see out the window, there's one here that's specific to Australia. So it's quite a cool thing. It's kind of this thing that looks like an elkhorn, and it represents Australia, which I think is pretty cool. Same with the nidiformis, the ghost fungus. It's only found in Australia and Tasmania. It's sometimes found in recently in Asia and so forth, but it's from Australia. So I think it's a real good mushroom to be proud of. On the right here, you can see a place called Camperdown Park, which is in Newtown, Sydney. And I found some nidiformis underneath a tree. So I put up a sign, as you can see there, kind of pointing it out and asking people, what is this mushroom? And a little QR code which told them the mushroom is a ghost fungus. It's interesting. It looks like an oyster mushroom, which you can get in lots of Asian stores. You can get it in supermarkets as well. The thing to keep in mind with this is if you look at the rim of the mushroom, it's kind of broken and not very regular, whereas an oyster mushroom is very smooth and regular. Also, there's a dark color to them, and obviously the differentiating factor is they glow in the dark, but you probably won't be out at night identifying mushrooms because you can't see anything. But what you will find, which is super cool, is that it will look a little bit like this. So this kind of eerie, ghostly, green, ghostbustery, slimy color. Very, very cool. And it's interesting, again, if you think from a evolutionary sense, like, why does this exist? And there's various theories about that. One of them is like the meat tasting fungus that I showed at the beginning, that a big problem with plants and fungi is that they're immobile, in that when they lay their seeds or spread their spores, they can't stand up and walk down the road, drop them, and then another fungus comes up. They need some sort of medium in between. So with plants, for instance, flowers attract bees. The bees attach pollen mistakenly to their fur, and then they fly and then they pollinate other plants. But with mushrooms, it's a bit more difficult because they're on the ground, they're not well coloured. So how else do they attract it? And one theory with the beefsteak mushroom and the chicken mushroom is that it's seen as carrion as animals which eat meat, meaning like it's trying to mimic a dead animal which bleeds or is red, for an animal to come up and then eat it or brush its fur against it and then move the spores to a different place so that more mycelium can grow and then the mushrooms pop out. And with the ghost fungus, it may be that it's nocturnal animals which then see it, pick it up, eat it, and then drop it somewhere else. So the next one is shaggy parasol, and I thought this was interesting, this article from The Guardian, and it was talking about in NSW recently that there was heavy rainfall, and what often happens with heavy rainfall is afterwards mushrooms start sprouting out, and this young gentleman realized that, and he had some mushrooms popping up in his garden, and I quote, "He first rubbed a piece of the mushroom against his skin and licked the toadstool about 20 minutes before taking a small bite. It was the same as biting into a mushroom in coals. it wasn't immediately bitter, so I thought nothing of it. 2 hours later, Herman began to experience violent vomiting and diarrhea and ended up in hospital for 2 days. I've never felt that sick in my life, he said. Well, that's not the way you should do it. You should be able to, you should have enough knowledge in your mind to be able to see this mushroom now and realize it's got gills. It'll be difficult to discern, and then therefore I keep walking. And with this guy, he saw free mushrooms. You can go to Cole, they cost a couple of bucks. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot safer. I'd much recommend doing that than going for this. And also, there are other mushrooms around. For instance, the saffron milkcap grows abundantly. We picked 8 kilograms, quite a few kilograms of them a few days ago, and delicious. Made some risotto, awesome. But yeah, if you see a poisonous mushroom and you're unsure of it, keep on walking. If you're unsure of any mushroom, you can pick it up. Make sure that you don't have cuts on your fingers and so forth. You don't need to have gloves, but just picking them up and having a look at them, trying to understand the structure of it, the physiology, the morphology is really interesting, how they differ in certain bits. So next one is the fly agaric, and you probably know this as the Super Mario mushroom, but unfortunately if you eat it you don't get bigger and are able to pick up turtles and throw them at dinosaurs. But yeah, it's called an amanita. It's part of a species, which a genus which is widely spread. Again, it's got gills, it's got a red top, white dots, which are very, very recognizable. And then you can see to the right, it's cousins and sisters. They're all white with gills, and it's a big no-no. One thing interesting with this slide is if you just have a look at the red and white fly agaric on the left, it represents the different stages, and hopefully we'll see that in a moment, that the young version of the fly agaric looks completely different to the older version. And you can see the young version on the right. Mushrooms, how they grow, they kind of begin in this ball, kind of like an egg, and then it grows a stalk, and then the egg kind of opens up, and then the spores come from the gills. Wind takes the spores and it carries them off. That's the idea. So it's small, it gets big. So when a lot of mushrooms look like babies, they look like little eggs which are in the ground. And I've often been with people foraging and asking me what these weird eggs are, and the thing is, you don't know, because the structure of it, the characteristics are nondescript yet. And often I will walk past a lot of mushrooms which you just don't know. You just don't know because it's in a very young stage and it hasn't blossomed out to reveal its full characteristics. So that's the fly agaric. And just to repeat very quickly, so death cap, yellow staining, ghost fungus, shaggy parasol, and fly agaric. That is a list of the mushrooms which poison people the most in Australia. So yeah, the next So the next category are the medicinal mushrooms, and being a pharmacy professional, I know a bit about kind of medicines and stuff. I was very interested in this when I did my pharmacognosy stuff. And what I realized after a while is through traditional Chinese medicine, or the various inputs to modern medicine, where these kind of medicines come from, there's a lot of ancient belief behind these things, but the problem is when you dig deep into the science, so you go and get scientific articles and get rid of the bias, think of placebo effect, think of the bias behind the structure of the study. You do something called a meta-analysis, which is looking at all the different studies, and there's zero evidence for these things. Very, very little evidence, and it's quite dangerous, I find, as well, because even though you're giving something that has no pharmacological efficacy, you can say that the person benefits from the placebo effect, which is still an effect, and it's great. It really can provide hope for people. But if these medicines are given at the detriment of other medicines which do work, then I think it's a problem, because the medicines that do work benefit from the placebo, but they also benefit from the effect that they produce pharmacologically on the body. So what I did was I had a look at lots and lots of different papers trying to look for something that is pharmacologically active, medicinal, and can help. And then I found this young person, psilocybin, and they grow everywhere. And this is just one of the many papers that are there. I mean, one of my favorite papers kind of describes the use of psilocybin as helping people become less egocentric and more ecocentric, which I've just fantastic, I think, in this day and age. But this here is another meta-analysis, which is kind of the top end of the hierarchy of scientific papers. It's essentially when you look at multiple papers at the same time, and they just found there's a fantastic effect on anxiety and depression. This is the abstract. I can read through it, but there's a lot of jargon in there, but if you would like some more information on it, I can definitely help. Unfortunately, in Australia, the psilocybin mushrooms are illegal. So here I'm just kind of highlighting how to make sure that you can avoid it appropriately. There is there is potentially some change in the legality of these. A couple of associations are petitioning something called the TGA in Australia, so Therapeutics Goods Association, and they're saying, well, if there's so much evidence, where is the harm involved? And also relative harm. It's a massive discussion, but it's a really interesting thing, thinking, wait, if this is illegal and it's actually medicinal, whereas there's other things like alcohol or cigarettes which are legal but have a very well documented harm, why is that? And it's a fantastic argument. It'd be good to, there's some more stuff about it on Mushroom Exam, so it's good to read up on it. But most common is psilocybe subs, they call it. They found growing on eucalyptus debris, and they start fruiting from between late April to early May and extends through to July or September. The cap measures between 1 to 6 centimeters and vary markedly in color. The dark to light caramel brown with a sticky texture. As the cap dries, they become light brown or golden brown and sometimes pale yellow or cream. The stem of the subs can be fibrous and often hollow, ranges from 5 to 10 centimeters, which you can see there. The color of the stem will also change over time. The gills, which is the underside, which you can't really see in that picture, are quite close together, and they're usually pallid, smoky brown with age, and they turn brown grey. And then the most identifying characteristic of these types of mushrooms are that when you press on them, they become blue. And one question some people have had is, if you press it, does it immediately become blue? And often not. But when you see the mushrooms themselves, they've sometimes been knocked over by the wind, or kangaroos jumped on them, and they often have a bit of bruising on them, which is very identifiable. So that's medicinal mushrooms. So we've done deadly and then medicinal, and we're going to move on to the one that probably the reason why you're all here is the tasty, delicious mushrooms. And there's quite a wide range of them. I've got a book which you can get these types of books, which are quite large, great large pictures, which we try to do on Mushroom Exam, kind of show you the entire structure of them and how they look in high def. But the problem with these types of books is you need to be wary about where they're printed. So this one I picked up in Australia, but I believe that it was printed in the UK. Yeah, so it's a UK number, so it's Blackfriars. And what happens is, so these get sold as these are mushrooms, but you'll very rarely see any of these mushrooms in Australia. There's actually, in Sydney, there's probably common species, very few in comparison to a book like this, and that's what I want to pop up here. But before we get on to that, the questions I think which are fundamental with these types of mushrooms is, when do they arise? So what time of year? You're going to go in winter, you're going to go when it's warm, you're going to go when it's raining. So what's the best time to get these things? Next one is where. So what are the best locations? Do they grow in city centres, or do you have to go into the middle of the desert to pick them up? And what are the best ones? So when, quite simply, is now. Now is April in Australia, and they occur between late February and late May. And the best time is just after heavy rains, as I've said before. So mushrooms don't actually need sunlight to grow because they don't photosynthesize. But what they do need is warmth of the mycelium, the roots of the mushroom underneath, which get warm. And then when they get to a certain temperature, between 24 and 28, potentially lower, they fruit these mushrooms which pop up, which are actually the sexual organs of mushrooms. But yeah, we won't get into that. Hopefully this YouTube channel doesn't get banned because of that. But yeah, I'm talking about sexual organs. So where are they? I'm in Sydney at the moment. This is so different places. Blue Mountains is fantastic, but in the centre of Sydney there's certain places, and I said Penrose in the south is pretty good. We've got a better map online inside of the mushroom exam course. This one is, there are, in the middle of Sydney, you can go and pick mushrooms. This again is Camperdown Park. On the left are the parasols I mentioned before, with the gills underneath. But then below that is something called a bolete, which was just growing not too far away, which is an edible species, a slippery jack. And then to the right there's something called the stinkhorns, which are non-edible. But the takeaway with this slide is that there's no gills. So what can you pick? Number one is slippery jack, aka the bolete. And what's interesting with that is the underneath of it there are no gills. The next one, which is the one exception to the rule because there are so many of these mushrooms out and about, is the saffron milkcap, which has very, very identifiable features which will drum home. And then the last one is the morel, which looks like this crazy alien brain thing. That's a lot rarer. What you'll be finding is really the slippery jack and the saffron milkcap, and out of those two, slippery jack isn't as tasty as the saffron milkcap. So the slippery jack, because it's a bolete, it doesn't have gills. It's got these holes, which is where the spores come out. It's a member of the bolete family. It has a slimy, chestnut, rusty, olive brown cap that may cause indigestion before eating. So you've got to peel off the top of it. The next one is the saffron milkcap. We get kind of a bit more in depth of this, and there's more information online. Keep remembering the cone of learning. This is just a lecture, and you'll probably get some of this and forget most of it. But the takeaway really for these is the colour. So it's kind of like an orange cinnamony colour. Then the cap has these circles around it, and it's got an umbo, so it's kind of like a little bit of a sink in it, and we'll see some of those later. And the stem is hollow. So here you can see a bit more information. Keep in mind the idea of like a young mushroom looks different to an older mushroom, but generally they do look with a stem and a cap. We'll see some of these later. And then the last one is a morel, which would be quite rare, but it's so identifiable. It's a great thing to come across. Usually they're in sandy areas and burnt out areas they're found. very distinctive. The only look-alike is actually the false morel, which is less conical, looks more like a kind of distorted brain and a little bit crazy. So those are the 3 different types of mushroom, and then this is really the summary of all of this. These are the 5 rules, and again, they're not for mushroom super experts, because they'll have a different rule. These rules are specifically for people starting out, which is trying to mushroom without having any fear. And the first point is you shouldn't pick mushrooms with gills. There's one exception in this, in the saffron milk cap, which we'll talk about. There's one here, but anything else without gills, not a good idea to pick. Only pick the mushrooms with tubes and spikes. There's a hedgehog mushroom, which is quite rare, but the tubes and spikes, the tubes represent the bullet species, which are very safe. If a mushroom smells rotten, so the stink horns, which were shown, the big red ones that you saw in Camp Down Park before, they smell to high heaven. So if it's rotten, if it smells rotten, if it's soggy, it's better to leave it behind. And then golden rule is never pick a mushroom that you do not know what it is. If you're stuck, you can post it on our Facebook group, so facebook.com/mushroom exam. And we're great at kind of discussing about the different, and we've got a few experts up there. And then the last one is never eat raw mushrooms, so never have this kind of tasting thing. Always cook these in a way that might destroy anything bad that's containing with them. So that's the end of this part. What next? You go to mushroom exam, you can take one of the exams, and what we basically do is show you lots and lots of pictures of 3 different mushrooms, one different mushroom, and ask you, is it medicinal, is it edible, or is it deadly? And we keep doing that until you fully understand. Then we put you through an exam, and then once you do that, then that's like the first step, the first rung. So in this next bit, we're going to look at some mushrooms themselves. So in this bit, we're going to look at a few specimens. So we've got different types, and you can see the different shapes and sizes that these come in. It's quite remarkable. I always wonder with dogs as well, like a Great Dane is the same species as a Chihuahua, and they can both bait. So it's the same with mushrooms. They've got a very wide form that they can take. So I think probably what the most recognizable one is this one, which is your Super Mario mushroom. Call it fly agaric or Amanita muscarina. And what you can see is on the underside white gills, and on the top side it's red with the white dots. This is a younger specimen, so it's kind of smaller, but it's just basically like a big version and a small version. But then this is a very, very young version. And what I was saying before about the ages, so it starts out as an egg and then grows into this kind of parasol shape and then releases its form. So it's always doing this. Similarly here, if you look at this saffron milk cap, it's like this, and then it's going to try and go like this. So this one is older, so it's always trying to throw out its spores, and that's a younger version as well. So young, middle, late. So saffron milk cap, as I said, very identifiable in these kind of rings around it. The coloration, when it's bruising, it's a little bit blue, but I think the most identifiable feature is when you pick it, and you don't need to pick with a knife, you can just pop it off with your finger, with your nail, is it's got a hollow stem and it's got these gills which go underneath, and there's this kind of blue striation underneath. But it's interesting in that these mushrooms come in different sizes. If you look in the books, they say they're between 6 centimeters and 10 centimeters, so forth, but they can grow into massive sizes. In fact, this is another one. It's a bit older now. And then that can even get to this size, which is a whopper. So if you look at my hand for reference, it's huge. So those are the saffron milk caps and the fly agaric, which you'll often see. Unfortunately, the bullet that I have isn't too great, but you can see on this bullet species that there's no gills. This is where the mushroom comes out of, and it's the lack of gills and the sponge underneath which is the most important. The rest of the species here that we have a lion's mane and something called a shiitake, a wood ear, which is kind of this gelatinous form. You see that wobble? Crazy. And then a king mushroom. This one is a lion's mane. is fantastic. It looks a little bit like a lion's mane or a coral. And as you can see here, it's white all the way through. So it breaks up almost like cheese with the strings popping out. These things are delicious. Saffron milk cap, yes, fantastic. You can't eat the fly agarics, but the shiitake, for its kind of meaty texture, is brilliant, and also as a meat substitute. These things are great, and they're free. You can go into the woods and pick them up. The jelly ear, the wood ear, it's got a different texture, which is kind of like an ear, and it's got a bit of a crunch, and that's fantastic in spring rolls. And then these kings, which you'll find in Asian superstores, and you can actually grow these at home quite well. Fantastic on skewers. So yeah, that's everything. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. If you've got any further questions, it'd be good to go to mushroomexam.com and have a look at some of the courses, and hopefully one of our tutors can help you get from the basic stage to more advanced stages of being able to identify these yummy morsels.